So the Fontaine main story arc is done, and there are a lot of thoughts to be had about that Archon quest full of lore bombs. And when it comes to Farina slash Focalor, because yes, they are the same person, just different aspects. Farina is not a clone or a child of Focalor, okay? I find her abdication a bold move that helps to cement resistance against the heavenly principles, which the other Archons seem to dream of doing but have their hands tied. And then there's Skirk and Sirtalogi, Neuvillette with his full powers, Fontainians being Oceanids, etc. All of those are mind-blowing things, but there's a small part of my mind that is just like, wow, white people nation is done. Maybe it's time to await a more culturally interesting region, like 9 months from now. Because as much as I like Fontainian characters a lot, there's a new horizon up ahead for us, represented by the succeeding nation of Natlan, shrouded in mystery with few mentions and no NPCs encountered so far. So, I take it upon myself to speculate on what we could possibly expect to see in Natlan society when we get there, plus a little strange theory I have about Natlan's international relations. If you think you find these kinds of content interesting, please do consider subscribing to the channel so you can catch more videos like this next time. Before I get into the video though, I just want to be honest and say I've had quite a hard time ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the bombings of Gazan citizens occurring until now, because it's a deeply disturbing issue considering how many lives are lost in one go in such an unjust and inexcusable manner. It's upsetting how the world can allow this many civilian casualties, or to those of us who are adamantly against it, it's an uphill battle where we have to go against more powerful entities running the show. Honestly, it's very difficult to know what to do because the options for helping are limited when it comes to donations, but hopefully, when the borders open up more, those of you who feel for the citizens will respond to the call of action. As of now, I guess spreading awareness can help at least forge a sense of solidarity with the affected people, but even that can't heal or revive them. So it's a very depressing situation. Hopefully, calls for a ceasefire will be heard soon enough, and until then, if you do want to cultivate your sense of empathy, do try to read up on the history of Israel and Palestine a bit, especially the 1948 Nakba, which I didn't know before, honestly. So that's a good place to start. I know this discussion was quite short and you might feel kind of ambushed by it, but I don't want people to go through my channel a year from now and feel like there was no disturbance in the world at all during November 2023. That's all, and I hope you're somehow also coping with the distressing news, while also hoping for the best, along with the rest of us who value human lives and human rights. So, going back to Natlan, you might be wondering, what is there for me to discuss? Isn't there like absolutely zero lore about Natlan right now, or at least maybe they're just sparse and insignificant? Well, now we have a better grasp of the nation through the new Battle Pass weapon called the Talking Stick, which is an obsidian club used by the historical hero of Natlan. Some lore enthusiasts might have already covered this, and you may also understand the lore already, but I'd like to cover the implications of the Talking Stick lore rather than just the story. So basically, it's called that because the club was used by the legendary hero Tenoch as a symbol to persuade the members of other tribes to join him in his battle to defend Natlan, supposedly. The main takeaway here is that Natlan follows a system involving 6 self-ruling tribes that seemingly have their own interests but cooperate for the greater good to some extent, at least through their chiefs meeting every now and then. What that could mean is the politics in Natlan might be much more complicated, with many leaders present rather than having one centralized authority like the past nations have. So people have to constantly make attempts at unity rather than that process being automatic. It will also mean that there's a wider range of diversity within Natlan. So to people who are worried about difficult to remember terms, do prepare your mental capacity for the prospect of having to remember tons of unfamiliar names, because Natlan as a nation seems to be very ambitious with how many cultures it wants to represent, kind of like Sumeru, which can be beneficial for covering a lot of ground when it comes to real life cultures, but also detrimental if it ends up implying that like all North and South American indigenous cultures or all African empires were like more or less the same. For reference, let's go through the historical figures mentioned in the talking stick lore and the real life cultures their names come from. So Tenoch hails from the Aztec civilization, which left its legacy in Mexico. Wanjiru is associated with Kenya, Menelik with Ethiopia. As for Sanhaj Compore, I'm quite confused because Sanhaj seems to point at an Amazigh confederation, but Compore seems to be a sub-Saharan African surname, so I'm not sure what the writers were doing with this one. Burkina, I think, is a reference to Burkina Faso. Sunjata is from Mali, and Tupac, not the rapper, the historical figure, was from the Incan civilization, now leaving its influence on Peru and other nearby Andean countries. So that's a lot. It's 2 whole continents, but if you're gonna attempt world building involving different tribes, then they all do have to be distinct. I'm just kind of worried about how accurate the delineation of these 6 tribes will be. Like, what if they mix the real life cultures indiscriminately? Like, first of all, Tenoch is Aztec, but none of the representatives of the other tribes are Aztec. So is the Aztec civilization counterpart a minor tribe in Natlan, or did they like mash Aztec and Inca into one tribe or something? And what about Yansan, the character revealed in the Travail teaser? The name is supposedly from Yoruba culture, which is native to Nigeria and other nearby countries. So I don't know which one of the 6 tribes that would fall under. Not to mention Xabalanque is Mayan, and that's different from Aztec and Inca, so which tribe does he come from? Although this setup is not insanely weird and random, considering there are many people with African descent living in Latin America right now, of course because of the slaves trade. But bits of African culture have been embedded into Latin American culture as well, so it's not entirely out there. But the dedication of one nation in Teva to 2 continents is still a bit wild. With all that in mind, the representation will probably be far from perfect, but at least some diversity is retained, and it puts more cultures on the map for a lot of us Genshin players who were not taught about indigenous American and African history properly. Another implication of this system is that each character will probably have their sense of identity be strongly dependent on their sense of belonging to a particular tribe. They'll probably work in the best interests of their tribe, and it could influence many of them to have this we versus them mentality, even though they might not necessarily be at war with one another. So it'll be interesting to see how these tribes relate to one another, as in which are the closest, which are the most distrustful of each other. And I can't wait to see how people from different tribes make friends and learn about each other's cultures to facilitate cultural exchange within the nation. Especially with a nation that concerns war, it would be important to figure out the role each tribe plays when it comes to furthering innovation in strategic war tactics. Like, they likely have varied war traditions and fighting styles, which can all contribute to the defense of Natlan. That is, of course, if they aren't currently fighting each other, which is a possibility too. I also hope to see instances of characters possibly leaving their original tribe to live with another tribe in Natlan that they believe exemplifies their values better, because internal migration within a nation is quite realistic. Actually, thinking about it, the writers for Natlan will need to somewhat represent all 6 tribes more or less evenly. And that's if all of them are still intact, of course, since some could have merged or split or were greatly reduced in number. Because that's really weird when there's one faction without a representative playable character to give us insight into it. Like the Fontaine Research Institute has no playable characters, so... Like I said though, not all 6 tribes may be intact, because for example, Vanessa's people were enslaved and brought out of Natlan. So in a sense, her tribe, dubbed by Venti as the Children of Murata, could have possibly disbanded. So in summary, I think for Natlan, we can expect lots of diversity, complicated politics, and an emphasis on a sense of belongingness for the characters. However, if you recall the story of Tenoch and his talking stick, it's clear that he lacks that sense of belongingness to a tribe, as he was a lone warrior wandering around gaining the favor of various tribes, but it was also said that he no longer belongs to a tribe in Natlan, meaning that he either renounced his tribe of origin or was kicked out, or both. Thus, he had to find his own path, and he needed his persuasion skills to relate with other tribes members, even if he seemed inherently untrustworthy because of his lack of affiliation. That's why I have a feeling that Natlan may present both the upsides of the tribe system, that being the close-knit sense of community, as well as its corresponding downsides like ostracization and increased pressure to conform to societal rules because your actions are likely to be monitored more closely. That's not to say, however, that these tribes are necessarily small, since the characters mentioned in the talking stick are namesakes of major rulers of large civilizations or empires, so some of Natlan's tribes might be actually very highly populated instead of few and dispersed like the Tanit tribe in the desert of Hadramaut, for instance. Anyway, going back to the issue of loners, I wonder if we'll encounter at least one playable character in Natlan who broke off their affiliation with their tribe of origin and chose not to join another. What if there's like a ragtag group of people like this? I think that'll be an interesting plot point if ever Hoyoverse does decide to execute it. Now, you may be wondering about how dragons have permeated Natlan society, with Neuvillette revealing to us that they have learned to coexist with humans in Natlan. Many of you may be imagining playable characters that are dragons, just like Neuvillette, but that may not necessarily be the case. Revisiting the talking stick lore, you will notice that each African-inspired character in the description has with them a companion, also with an African name. But when you search these names, you'll find out they're mostly the names of dinosaurs or other extinct reptiles that used to roam Africa. Thus, I think we can infer that these companions are actually the dragon pets of the tribe representatives. So yes, Natlan might be like How to Train Your Dragon Part 4, essentially. And I think there might be some playable characters specializing in dragon care. However, that's not to say that it's totally impossible for humanoid dragons to exist, because some could have evolved into that form recently. But just to be safe, based on the talking stick lore, don't get your hopes up too much for Neuvillette 2.0 or Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae 2.0 or something. So now that we've discussed what Natlan society could be like, what could the Archon possibly be like? Well, first of all, she has to be tan-skinned. If she's not tan-skinned or dark-skinned, I will lose faith in humanity, because she's meant to be the representation of indigenous American and African civilizations. The Pyro Archon a millennium ago, during Vanessa's time, was described by Venti to look like her, so I guess yeah, a tan or dark-skinned woman would be expected, even if the Pyro Archon now might be different. However, about that, people do speculate that Murata, the name of the Pyro Archon, which is weird because it's a Japanese name, but it can be African according to some baby name sites. So yeah, that's totally reliable and not weird at all. Anyway, people seem to think of her as the current Pyro Archon, considering Venti seemed to speak of her and Zhongli with somewhat equal familiarity. That idea is rooted in assumptions that don't have such a strong basis though. But interestingly, in Zhongli's 5th character story, it is stated that the 7 seats changed and again were changed, implying that maybe either the Pyro Archon or the Cryo Archon or both of them have been replaced more than once. So I actually wonder if the Pyro Archon will be the first non-original Archon that rose to power not during the Cataclysm. It could be that she became Archon before or far after the Cataclysm already, or it could be that there were more than 2 Archons in Natlan's history. That would be unique and also somewhat sensible, considering war could induce abrupt and quick changes in leadership. And what if you were allowed to ascend to Pyro Archonship by defeating the previous one? I don't know. But maybe not, that's just throwing it out there. I think there are speculations too about multiple Pyro Archons currently, which can make sense because there are various tribes, but I'm not sure about its potential validity. As for her personality, her quote from the Agnidas Agate gem seems to be quite ominous, and she possesses the value of war, so she could likely be fierce, destructive, proud, and serious. Venti does describe the Pyro Archon as being a wayward, war-mongering wretch, and although we're not sure if he's necessarily referring to the current one, it is likely to represent any Pyro Archon anyway, whether past or present. But in the same sentence, you will find him referring to Zhongli as a buffoon, which can be considered more of an affectionate joke rather than a realistic assessment of him, and we know Venti likes to fabricate history for his silly poetry sometimes. Thus, I think the Pyro Archon is actually not a warmongering wretch, but rather the opposite, which makes Venti's humor funnier to him, I suppose. I think it's possible that she could be more prudent with a strong sense of responsibility while also being very intimidating. As for what she does with the value of war, there's probably more to it than meets the eye. Compared to the other national values, Natlan's value of war seems to be the only one with a strictly negative connotation, because war is destructive like how fire burns. And yet that chapter of the overall storyline is entitled Incandescent Ode of Resurrection, meaning that it is possible for new life to be born from destruction. As for what that means, we have yet to find out, but I would like to hope that Natlan's war has a greater purpose when it comes to fighting evil or rebelling against the divine, and that it's not necessarily senselessly motivated. I wonder if war can also be something more figurative, like for instance, war on corruption perhaps? War can represent the fight for certain values rather than strictly slaughter and destruction, although of course we will see a lot of the latter most likely. Since war is a very serious matter and produces lots of casualties, I hope the writing for Natlan will be mature and politically informed rather than the way the civil war in Inazuma went, where it was brushed aside quickly even though that's not realistic. I also wish they'd delve into the potential moral ambiguity of some of the characters to confront their harmful participation in war. An honest view of the Pyro Archon will be necessary, and I hope that dialogue does push through in some way to give us better insights on the matter. Anyway, speaking of the characters' moral ambiguity, I'd like to try to speculate about the types of characters the game will make playable in terms of their occupation and background. Of course, as the nation of war, there should be many warriors because that's their national value, and each warrior, especially those who are generals, can give us insight into how they understand war, their motivations for participating in it, and be first-hand testaments to the pain it causes. However, not all characters should be professional warriors or should serve the defense forces of their respective tribes, since that limits the diverse range of stories to be told. I do think there will be at least one playable character who is their tribe's chief, although not all 6 tribes will have playable chiefs, I think, but there should be around one who is, because all nations do have playable characters who are higher-ranking government officials who help us understand the ruling customs of their respective nations. I predict there will be some doctors because there needs to be someone to nurse the wounded, and there could likely be religious figures like priests and priestesses who perform rituals and communicate thoroughly with the Pyro Archon, who is implied to be somewhat easily reachable as mentioned by Sunjata, who got to talk to her in the Talking Stick lore. Aside from this, there will probably be characters who represent other cultural facets like artisans, performers, and possibly even scientists as well who keep track of natural phenomena. Fortune tellers can also be present since Sanhaj Kompore was implied to see the future of Tenoch's demise. Interestingly enough, I think there's also room for some pacifists to exist in Natlan because while their national value is war, previous nations have had characters who go against the rigid imposition of their national values, like with the resistance in Inazuma or the artists in Sumeru. I wonder if we'll encounter characters in Natlan that actually advocate against war, so they are actually having a war on war. This may or may not happen, but I think the possibility would be interesting to explore. Another character we might encounter is a harbinger because, each nation truly needs its evil representation. And who might that be? Yes, I'm referring to Capitano because although he is sometimes speculated to be the blood-stained knight, my impression of that guy is he kinda went insane or corrupted, so he probably wouldn't have accepted Piero's recruitment if ever. It's also noteworthy that the main antagonist harbingers of each region are in a sense making a homecoming, except for Child, of course, so it is possible that Capitano could be doing the same. After all, I did mention that the political sphere in Natlan could be quite complicated with many tribes involved, so who better to navigate it than someone who actually used to be part of this society and knows its rules. Interference in Natlan politics will also require someone insanely powerful, and Child describes Capitano like that, and it would be helpful if he learned some combat techniques from his own nation of origin. Well, anyway, I could be biased because I'm kinda sick of the idea of all fair-skinned harbingers, and I believe harbinger likers, even though I'm not one myself. You guys deserve someone whose skin doesn't reflect like a light bulb, even if they are hiding every bit of their skin. So yeah, we'll just have to wait and see, but for now, I am a Natlan Capitano truther. So I may have discussed the intricacies of Natlan society, but many of you might still have a narrow view of the nation despite that, since tribes are usually associated with primitiveness, so to speak, and many non-white civilizations throughout history are often deemed as less advanced, even with their insane architecture or detailed record keeping. I mean, have you seen the Chichen Itza Machu Picchu Timbuktu, which was a center of scholarship back in the day? Those feats were insanely astounding, so I really need you guys to understand that Natlan could possibly be more advanced than you think it is. Sure, they likely don't have the same technological prowess as Fontaine, but they might have electricity already, considering how even Mondstadt, which is based on the medieval era, seems to have actual functioning street lamps. In Natlan, other technologies could include the types used in recording natural phenomena like volcanic activities. They could be into geology as well, and some could even work on astronomy and or astrology. They can also possess advanced technologies for carrying out wars, since there's always a pressure to innovate beyond what the enemy is capable of. Then lastly, I think a huge part of Natlan's scientific knowledge will be applied to agriculture. Which brings me to my fun little theory. So every February 14 and March 14 of each year, we have the charismatic female and male characters of Genshin present us with chocolates for Valentine's Day and White Day respectively, and chocolate is known to exist in the game as an ingredient for drinks in the bartending event and is also mentioned in other random conversations. But think about it, where is chocolate produced? Well, the only possible answer is Natlan because cacao is an agricultural product that has been historically cultivated in North and South America, and as of now, its biggest grower is actually Ghana, which is in Africa, so on all counts. Natlan should be the source of Tevat's cocoa, which becomes chocolate once processed by other nations. And so I surmise that the cacao industry in Natlan is actually huge and serves as one of the nation's key lucrative exports. So even though Natlan has hardly been involved in Tevat matters so far in our journey, their products show us how integrated they are with the rest of the world regardless. And this cacao cultivation can point towards their overall expertise in agricultural methods. I think overall, people tend to undermine this kind of knowledge because we think, oh, it's just planting, like no big deal. But someone like Dilok will tell you that no, growing stuff is actually an immensely elaborate procedure with many factors to take care of, and knowledge of this is heavily based on both scientific and historical records. These cacao don't grow themselves, with ancient American civilizations happening to benefit from them. No, they had to make the effort to truly grow these, and they disseminated this knowledge as well. That's what makes colonization such a huge shame as well, because colonizers took this source of productivity from the native population and exploited their labor and natural resources for their own gains. However, Natlan seems to involve indigenous cultures which are unaffected by colonialism. So Natlan's gains from the cacao trade may perhaps aid their own development. And that's why, in addition to the types of playable characters I mentioned previously, I really hope that there would be one character who is extremely well versed in cacao production and runs the cacao trade for the benefit of their tribe or the rest of the nation. Someone who does own the cacao plantation and uses it to empower employees rather than oppress them because, let us have our escapism. Basically, think of Natlan's version of Dilok, the plantation expert who is the main driver of exports and economic progress of the region. This is a bit of wishful thinking considering that the past few nations after Mondstadt and Liyue have had a notable lack of business sector representation, even if it would have added something valuable to the world building. But I'm just gonna hope hard that Natlan does get back into the business lore game by discussing the cacao trade. At the very least, they can have an NPC run it if they don't want to dedicate a playable character to the endeavor, even though I think they totally should. So with all that said, how good does Natlan's story seem to be so far? I personally think it could be rather interesting with its potential to depict a unique societal structure and provide a good commentary on war. But above all, I'm very excited for the representation Natlan can possibly provide us because hardly any fantasy genre media represents indigenous American and African civilizations with depth and character development. However, I can't speak for the people from there who are more familiar with their own cultures and histories. What I've learned from Sumeru as someone who is both a member of the Genshin fandom and is part Indian, I learned that the depiction was very, very far from perfect, with colorism being evident in the playable characters to the mishmashing of unique cultures which can be considered kinda orientalist, to the inaccuracies of some naming customs or some clothing designs. Still, despite that, because Hoyoverse attempted to represent South Asia, West Asia, and Northern Africa, it was an invitation for lots of fans from those regions to comment on the representation and discuss cultural inspirations from their own countries. It's through the Genshin fandom where I learned about Zoroastrianism, the term Amazigh, certain historical figures from real life from those regions, that even though the game was lacking in many ways, it managed to invite many fans to speak about their own unique cultures and put them on the map. So when Natlan comes out, I'm super excited to see Latin American, and African Genshin players post their threads on Twitter about the real-life cultural inspirations the game borrowed from, and if you end up doing that, I will most likely follow you and like every tweet in the thread. It's also worth mentioning that by writing and marketing playable characters from these cultures, the game is helping us to understand the humanity and depth of people from places we haven't met yet, and that can help us challenge our preconceived views on them if ever. Not to say that Genshin will stop racism, but it can make us think like, oh yeah, maybe not all people from the Middle East are religious or follow social rules strictly. Some small things like that. And I hope that Natlan can accomplish a similar thing. Nonetheless, we can still critique instances of racism or questionable representation because we need to train ourselves to identify these flaws and stand up against them instead of kissing the ass of this one company. Especially if I see one fair-skinned person in Natlan, we will be holding up our pitchforks. So yes, do brace yourselves for the discourse, but hopefully it will be more productive and insight-generating rather than simplistic and anger-inducing. And do always remember to listen to the people whose cultures are being represented, alright? Anyway, that was a lot already, so I'm gonna end it here. I am looking forward to Natlan, obviously, while still also enjoying the rest of Fontaine, and I really hope to have a lot of favorite characters from that region so I can collect more Pookie Bears who will change my life in the next year. But what about you guys? Are you excited for Natlan? What do you expect? Leave a comment down below for my other viewers to see so you can have a nice chat. Anyway, I do hope you found this video helpful when it comes to breaking down Natlan's potential arc. If you like the way I dissect and speculate on lore through video essays like this one, I hope you could consider subscribing to my channel to catch more videos like this. And I'll see you in the next one.